Welcome to Digital Lodge number 1, where in this video we explore the true origins of Masonic ritual by cutting through myth to examine how the ceremonies of modern Freemasonry developed organically from the working practices of medieval stonemasons. Modern speculative Freemasonry no longer builds physical cathedrals, yet it preserves the tools and language of the operative mason as symbols of moral and spiritual development, transforming the square, compasses, level, and plumb from instruments of labor into emblems of conduct, balance, integrity, and self-discipline. With these lessons transmitted through a degree system as a method of instruction that moves from simple truths to deeper principles. Modern Freemasonry is organized around 3 principal degrees: entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason, which represent stages of personal and moral development rather than rank or authority. A man progresses through these degrees sequentially, receiving instruction appropriate to each stage, with each degree building upon the last through symbols, obligations, and teachings that unfold gradually, allowing deeper meanings to emerge over time. To understand where the system originated, we must look to operative masonry before 1717, when Freemasons were still engaged in actual building work and ritual was simpler and more practical. The first degree, then known as the Apprentices part, often consisted of little more than the communication of the Mason's word, a secret means of recognition. The admission of an apprentice was nevertheless serious and binding, and from hints preserved in the old charges we can reconstruct its general outline. The lodge opened with prayer, the legendary history of the craft was read, the candidate placed his hand upon the volume of the sacred law while the common charges were recited, a brief collective obligation was taken, followed by special charges for an apprentice, and finally a more solemn obligation binding the candidate to secrecy, after which the secret signs and modes of recognition were communicated. Before admission, the apprentice had to prove himself of lawful age, free-born, sound in mind and body, of good character and reputable habits, after which he was bound by indenture to a master mason, usually for 7 years, during which he was taught the trade, disciplined in conduct, required to obey strict moral and social rules, and gradually advanced from menial labor to more responsible work as his skill increased. At the end of this apprenticeship he presented his masterpiece for examination before the lodge, or in earlier times an annual assembly of masons, and upon passing was admitted as a fellow of the craft, a status often equivalent to what later became known as a master mason. At this point another solemn oath was taken and further modes of recognition were given, including the 5 points of fellowship, granting the mason full rights as a free man, able to earn his own living, take apprentices, and participate fully in lodge affairs. At some point, men who were not operative stonemasons, but gentlemen, scholars, clergy, and professionals began to be admitted into lodges. These men are known as accepted masons. Because they were not entering the craft to learn a trade, the long operative apprenticeship model did not make sense for them, and as a result, these men were often admitted as both apprentice and fellow in a single shortened ceremony. When the first Grand Lodge was formed in 1717, Freemasonry underwent a major reorganization, as the creation of a central authority allowed traditions to be gathered, compared, and standardized, leading to rapid ritual expansion. As of when Anderson's constitutions were published in 1723, the Grand Lodge still only recognized 2 degrees of Masonry, that of enter apprentice and fellow craft. At this point, lodges had become centers of discussion, education, and Enlightenment thought. Ritual was no longer merely about trade qualifications, it was becoming a vehicle for moral and philosophical instruction. It is within this context that John Theophilus Desaguliers emerges as a pivotal figure. Desaguliers was an Enlightenment thinker, scientist, Anglican clergyman, and one of the most influential figures in early Grand Lodge Masonry. Outside of Freemasonry, he was already known for developing a graded system of instruction, teaching scientific and philosophical concepts by leading students from simple principles to more complex truths. This educational method mirrors the degree system that would soon define speculative Masonry. In 1721, Desaguliers visited the Lodge of Edinburgh and requested meetings with its wardens and deacons. This visit likely gave him first-hand exposure to the older Scottish ceremonies, including their structure, symbolism, and use of progression. It is widely believed that Desaguliers used this opportunity to adapt operative ritual into a speculative framework, reorganizing existing material into a coherent system suited to moral instruction and transforming operative customs into a philosophical system, linking the intellectual climate of the Enlightenment with ancient rites. The origins of the 3rd degree, or Master Mason's degree, is widely debated and will be discussed in more detail in a later video. but what we do know is that the first record of it being worked was in 1725, in the Apollonian Society for Lovers of Music and Architecture. This was a society that was composed of all Freemasons, although it was not recognized by the newly formed Grand Lodge as a regular constituted lodge. This resulted in an investigation by the Grand Lodge and eventually a cease and desist letter to the society. The group simply replied that they could do what they wanted and ignored the order. Later that year, the Grand Lodge authorized all lodges to be allowed to work the third degree. It is difficult to determine where the degree originated. Some think that it was an invention of decilers, and prior to 1725, it was only allowed to be worked by Grand Lodge or lodges specifically given permission by Grand Lodge. Others believe that it was in existence prior to the formation of the Grand Lodge, being worked by a minority of lodges, and it wasn't until 1725 the Grand Lodge permitted it to be worked. Either way, even after Grand Lodge gave its blessing for lodges to be allowed to work the degree, it was still not required. The vast majority of lodges either could not or chose not to confer the degree right up until the 1740s. If a fellow craft wanted to be raised to the degree of Master Masons, he needed to join a Master Lodge. The Grand Lodge did not formally and officially recognize Freemasonry as a three-degree system until Anderson Constitutions were republished in 1738. However, there is record of the Deputy Grand Master only being a fellow craft in 1751, showing that even at that time, some Masons never received the third degree. It is important to note that it remained regular practice to confer the first and second degree in a single ceremony up until 1777, when the Grand Lodge decided that these degrees must be done on separate nights. Freemasonry stabilized and continued to develop throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries, not by altering its core structure, but by expanding and clarifying its instructional content through the addition of formal lectures, explanations, and standardized symbolism. What had originally been relatively concise ceremonies were gradually supplemented with detailed catechisms and lectures designed to explain the moral, philosophical, and historical meanings of the rituals, ensuring that candidates did not merely experience the degrees but understood them. One of the most influential figures in this process was William Preston, whose lectures, first systematized in the 1770s and published in Illustrations of Masonry, organized the teachings of each degree into a coherent educational framework, and became enormously popular in England and beyond. Alongside Preston, Thomas Smith Webb performed a similar role in America in the early 1800s, adapting Preston's work to the American context and helping to standardize ritual practice across the United States. By the early 19th century, these combined efforts had transformed Freemasonry into a fully developed system of progressive moral instruction, with the three degrees supported by explanatory lectures that fixed their symbolism, stabilized their transmission, and brought the ritual machinery of modern Freemasonry to its mature form. As Freemasonry spread beyond Britain, and new Grand Lodges formed in different countries during the 18th century, additional or higher degrees began to appear, often created to expand upon themes already present in the craft degrees or to preserve local traditions, philosophical ideas, and historical legends that were not fully expressed in the original system. These degrees developed independently in various regions and were eventually organized into appendant bodies and rites, such as the Scottish Rite and the York Rite, each offering its own sequence of teachings beyond the lodge. Despite this growth and diversity, the foundation of Freemasonry has always remained the same. The first three degrees entered Apprentice, Fellow Craft, and Master Mason, which form the essential core of the craft. Regardless of jurisdiction, language, or ritual variation, these three degrees are universally recognized and shared by all regular Masonic bodies, making them the common bond that unites Freemasons worldwide to this day. Masonic ritual didn't appear overnight. It evolved over centuries from real work, real obligations, and real craftsmanship. The three degrees take us on the timeless journey of the Mason, from apprentice to skilled craftsman to master, revealing that these rituals are far more than ceremony. They are a living tradition, turning the tools and practices of operative Masons into powerful lessons of character, morality, and self-mastery. If this exploration sparked your curiosity, subscribe to Digital Lodge Number 1 and join us as we continue to uncover the history, symbolism, and philosophy of Freemasonry, one degree at a time.